Welcome back to Sevenfold. In today's tutorial, we're going to be looking at a Grasshopper workflow and how to break up your panelization system into a series of typical types based off of if you have a gradient pattern, how to actually get typical colorations within that, no matter how many divisions you specify. So we'll show you how to organize your data like that. And then also using the Lunchbox Excel plugin, show you how to structure your data so that you can export it to an Excel file and then do a takeoff from that. So let's go ahead and look at the finished product here real quick. Here's just, I'm not going to show how to model this, pretty straightforward. Basically just a lofted through some curves here. I've used the Lunchbox plugin to panelize this. And then what we are looking at is taking a gradient, specifying the number of divisions here. You can see it's at 3, so there's this blue color, this aquamarine, and then this green color. That's referencing from here. Now if I increase that step to something like 10, now you're actually going to be pulling even more divisions and getting 10 different types, but within that bay you're going to have a typical coloration for each. So this can help you reduce or increase the number of typical panels you use rather than having every single panel be 100% unique. So this is a great way to help handle some value engineering processes. And then finally, how to sort of structure your data in a way that makes sense for Excel. It's a pretty short workflow. Couple things is just how to structure your data, how to divide things up, and get it ready to go. So let's go ahead. I'm going to start by just copying this portion out, which is just the modeling piece. And I'm going to start a new document and just paste that in just to get started. And turning that on, again, this is just a Lunchbox plugin if you're not familiar. It's pretty well documented elsewhere. And I've got this surface here as well. That's just a loft. So that's where we're going to pick up. And then the other thing I'm going to copy through is just this gradient to save some time on the editing of that gradient. Okay. So how do we get there? Well, I want to work backwards from the gradient first. So to get those equal divisions, I'm going to leave the default inputs and outputs to 0 and 1 and just work with this t value. So to do that, I'm going to go to the sets tab, range, and then specify the domain is default to 0 to 1. So I'm just going to specify the number of steps I want. So I'm going to say 1, less than 10, less than 20, just to give myself a slider from 1 to 20 with 10 as the default. Then I'm going to plug that in and maybe increase it up to like 12. Okay. Maybe let's do 8 just to kind of get going. Now what it's going to do, if I just pull up a panel here, is it's going to give me 8 different divisions. And if I run that through the t value, that's going to give me the equivalent color at each of those divisions. Okay. So now what I want to do is get a percentage for each of these panels based off of where they fit into each of these buckets. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and go to the surface tab, go to surface closest point, and I'm going to deconstruct this point here in a second, but to get that point, I'm going to do area on each of these panels, and then that's going to find a point here. I'm going to use this centroid point as the input point, and then the surface is my base lofted surface. And that's going to go ahead and give me a point. Now, why it's nice is because I reparameterized this surface, that's going to give me a percentage from 0 to 1, no matter how big the length of my surface is. So if I go to the vector tab and this deconstruct point, what I can do now is, if I just look at the panel, each of the y and the x values are going to give me a percentage from 0 to 1. So it's always going to be less than 1, but never always less than 1 and always more than 0. So you can see the top one is here at 99%. Okay. So now I want to use that as a testing mechanism for each of the panels to see which value it's landing in. All right, so to do that, I need to do a test per panel, per point against this range system. So what I need to do is first graft each panel and then feed that in. So it's got a dedicated branch. I'm gonna right click and simplify just to kind of help out the branching there. And then I wanna say, go ahead and test for this value. So I'm gonna go to the math tab and go down to includes. And I'm gonna test each of these Y values against the domain. Well, how do I get the domain? See, this isn't domain, these are just numbers. So what I wanna do is actually take a domain, so construct a domain, and I can feed that into this default domain. It's just 0 to 1 by default. And then I can also go to domain and divide domain right here. And it's gonna just take an I for the domain. So feed that same domain in, and then the count of divisions is just the same number of division steps. So I can relabel this just for clarity and say number of typical panel colors, right? That's what I'm getting after here. Okay. So what this is going to give me by contrast is actually domains instead of numbers. Okay. So now I'm going to feed those domains into the domain here. And that's going to test and return a true false value for each of these domains. And then I just want to return the one that is true. Okay. All right. So to get that, I want to search for member index, and that member index is right here in the sets tab. And the member I'm searching for is the true Boolean. So if I just pull up a Boolean and make that a true, that's the member I'm searching for. And the set I'm searching against is this these sets here. So then when I come back, that's going to tell me at which branch the index where the value is true. I should only have one value per branch. Okay. So now what I can do is, instead of getting the number here, I want to retrieve the corresponding value for each branch based on the colors. So what I can do for that is just do list item, and I can say feed in this list and pull out these branches. Okay. And if I check that, now I'm getting the color for each of those. Okay. So what I could do if I wanted to preview this, I could take these colors and just simply feed in a custom preview and let that be the M. The geometry it would associate with is actually my original grafted surfaces. And if that's not working for me, okay. So basically when I added in this domain here, a couple things happened. You could just simplify this, but what I like to do is pick the principal. So if I right click and say principal, that's going to make sure that this is the one driving the grafting. So I'm basically making everything relative to the organization of my surfaces. So when I just change that to principal, that simplified this over here as well. Okay, so then when I feed those surfaces in to my geometry, now you can see I'm getting that preview of what to expect. If I just hide some of this information, you can see it a little bit more clearly. That's kind of the divisions that I'm expecting. If I was to change this from the Y to the X, that would flip it and make it go horizontally. Okay. Okay. So now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and I've got my colors assigned I want to start making this ready for Excel. So if you go to Lunchbox and you go over here to workflow, there's actually an Excel write, and this needs a bunch of information. And I'll go through this, but the biggest two things is the data and the headings. So what we can do is we're going to figure out how many counts we have of each of these panel types, and then get the RGB value associated with that, as well as the panel name. So I'm going to go ahead and, so the first thing I'm going to do is I've got RGB values coming out. What I want to do is, because they're aligned by the gradient, I'm going to leave them in the order they are already at. So to get a coloration, to get a number for how many panels we have of each, I'm going to do a member index. And the members I'm going to be searching for are each of my colors that I've divided. So that's the members to search for. And I'm going to search for it against this entire set. Now, before I bring this all in, I'm just going to flatten this input. And that's going to tell me, when I feed this in, how many of each type of panel color there are. So you can see there's 0 of 47, 79, 79. Then I'm going to give these a unique name. So I'm going to just create something like special gradient blue, and then concatenate just using the ampersand. And then I'm going to alt-drag a copy and just add a space right there. And then just to get the index, I'm just going to do indices of each of these, which is just going to return the number there. Zooming in, adding a plus. This is a pufferfish component, I believe. And then that's going to give me the name of each of my panels. Feel free to be a little bit more specific, maybe use a naming convention, whatever you want to build up, but that's kind of the name I'm giving each of these. And then I want to go ahead and use an entwine. So that's going to merge each of this into its own tree branch, because when we feed the data in, each of the headings is going to need, each branch is going to have to align up to the heading. So the first heading I want to put in, if I just do a panel, and then I right click and say multi-line data, the first heading I'm going to call panel name. The second heading I'm going to call RGB. The third heading I'm going to call quantity, QTY. And make these whatever you want, but this is a single flat list, and the first set of data will be panel name. So that's going to be this batch here, and I'm going to feed that in. The RGB values are going to be from back here. I'll get that in a second. So these feed into headings. This guy, this is my entwined data. If I want to visualize that, I can just feed it into a panel here. You can see I've got one branch and I got to fill in these other two. So then I'm going to feed that into data. And then the next set of data is the RGB values. So that's my original values back here. And then those get fed in. And the final is how many of each we have. So I've already done that through the colors picked. We've synthesized that down. And now if I check the numbers here, you can see those are my quantities. So I can just feed those numbers directly in. And then that branch gets overridden to 0, semicolon 2. And that's all we need to do. So the final step is just to put in a Boolean toggle, false, just by default. We'll use a false for now until we're ready to go. Then for the path, we need to explicitly type that out. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my desktop. I'm going to, what I typically do is I'll shift right click I hold shift right click, that opens up this copy as a path option. Then I can just paste that in without quotes or anything. That'll bring up that file name. And then I can just say, okay, let's go ahead and just give this a different name. Okay. So now I've got a unique name. I've spelled it out. I've said, here's the file name, and I've given it an extension of XLSX, which is for Excel. Feed that into the path, and then the worksheet is within a given path. So that's, this is kind of an example of the output. This little tab down here is the worksheet. So I'm just going to mimic that by calling it sheet 1 without a space and hit OK. That's the default. I'll just leave that alone. Feed that in a worksheet. And then finally, I'm going to alt check a copy of this Boolean and set it to true for clear. So that'll reset the data each time you want to write it out. One quirk with this is you can't leave, to my knowledge, you can't leave this file open while you're writing data. You have to close it each time. And then when you're ready, you go ahead and publish that by saying Boolean true. And then that's going to go ahead and process for a second. So it may take a minute to process, but when you're done, you should be able to go over to your desktop or wherever you saved it, open up that new Excel file. And if you're seeing these little pound signs, that means you just don't have enough space. And then you can just see your results there. One more little improvement that I typically make is if you have more than 1,000 of any type, you might want to format the data a little bit before you export. You could always format that in post, but I like to format that in Grasshopper ahead of time. So if you want to format your quantities, what you can do is just type in format, and then there's a bunch of, I'll just tell you the ones that you need to know. There's a whole bunch of syntax on this stuff, but you want to feed your numbers, your quantities into the 0 input, and then you want to do this syntax. So do quotes for a panel, do open brackets, 0, and then that's targeting the 0 data input, and then N0. That's not an O, that's a 0, and then close brackets. So we've got 0, colon, capital N, 0, close brackets. Feed that into the formatting culture. And you might not see results here right away, but if I was to crank up this, let me just disable this Excel component for a second. If I go back to the beginning here and I increase this to a lot more like 120 and maybe 100, that's going to obviously increase the amount of panels I have, which is going to weigh down my model. But if I had that many models, you can see now, before it was like this, and then afterward it was like this with the comma, where it's comma separated every 1,000. So then if I feed that data in, now I'm going ahead and getting my thousands included because I've formatted it. And a couple other just quick tips that I like to use for formatting, might be a separate video, but if you just, instead of N0, if you just do 00 or 000, that will make sure you can add leading zeros to your numbers if you need to keep a consistent 3-digit code. So if you have like more than 100 items, you can make sure it's always a 3-digit number, even when it's like below 100. Okay, so we can talk all about formatting in a future lesson. If you're curious, just let me know. So yeah, once we're done with that, you can go ahead and just re-enable your component here, or just toggle true. Give it a second because it's got a lot more data. And let's see if that overrode the values. So if I just recompute, I think this might not work. So you might just have to jostle this a little bit, turning it to true to false, back to true. But once you get the hang of it, once you know how to work with your data, it's pretty slick. Yeah, so you can see the quantities have updated, and there's my RGB values and my quantities. So this can be really nice because what we did here is we were able to reorganize the information based upon the color that was there. So this was testing every single color and then saying, go grab the index of that, reformat it, and then give me a quantity of how many I have for each of those. Now this is a pretty, standard example. You could probably calculate that with the UNV divisions, and it's pretty predictable. But in cases where you don't know how many you have across a lot bigger set where it's a lot more randomized, this is a great way to get quantity takeoffs based on sort of input criteria. So yeah, definitely leverage this member index component, super powerful, and leverage this write to Excel component. Couple limitations that I've heard about is you can't write to more than one worksheet at a time, and you have to have a flat list for all the headings, and then each of the data coming in should be on its own branch. So don't do multiple branches. Just you have to simplify the data set back to the headings. I haven't been able to add any sort of sub lists of data so far. Right now it's pretty much just building a data set, and then I'll use this as a starting point to build Power BI dashboards. So I won't do a ton of formatting directly in Excel. I'll use this as a starting point and then do all my formatting in Power BI that you can refresh from this raw data set. So hopefully that makes sense. And yeah. All right, did you like that one? I know there was a ton of, there was no documentation on using write to Excel. I used to use a plugin called Bumblebee, which was maintained for a little bit of time and it's no longer being maintained. It had a bunch of formatting tools to be able to customize Excel directly out of Grasshopper and then refresh things. But like I mentioned, if you use Power BI, you can kind of disassociate all the formatting directly in Excel and use Excel more like a sort of loose database, which is a great way to go. So let me know what types of exercises, studies that you're using to publish out data sets and query your BIM model, whether it's Rhino or Revit. I have a couple other workflows in the similar vein that I was starting to study in Revit using Rhino Inside, but for now, I think this was one of those tutorials that wasn't really out there, so I figured I would just kind of publish it quick. But yeah, let me know what else you're looking forward to learning, and hopefully you enjoyed this one. Like I mentioned before, if you haven't already checked it out, the BIM Academy is live and active right now. Definitely head over there and sign up for a free account. It's a great way to work through a structured learning environment, track your progress, and see the sort of multiple series of YouTube videos that I've created. Some of them are 2 parts, some of them are multiple parts, and you can see if you're tracking along over there. And then also there's gonna be more course content that I'm working on right now that'll be available in the coming weeks and months. Definitely stay tuned for that. And the other things that I'm looking at doing is some live workshops where you can come on to a show and actually ask me questions live, get your questions sort of asked and answered. So typically I'm looking at maybe Friday evenings or Saturday mornings, just let me know. So I'm gonna get better at creating a regular rhythm for that to be available, but that gives you an opportunity to ask your questions with me and maybe show your screen or something like that. Yeah, so hopefully you enjoyed this lesson. Stay curious, my friend, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.